Barrie, Ontario. And yes, I am absolutely delighted to be here. It's a real opportunity, and it's a real privilege to join you virtually. I must admit, I prefer the hustle and bustle of a conference room with people straggling in and a little bit of, do you really want to stay and listen to this lady, or should we go somewhere else? However, Zoom does allow us to do a few things that we would not otherwise be able to do during this time. And I'm grateful for this opportunity. I am a postdoc at Western University and was probably the last live PhD defense that happened within the School of Kinesiology before COVID-19 announced its arrival. So again, thanks for having me. And I'm always fall behind when I do these things. So I want to start and acknowledge Dr. Laura Meisner at Western University, who has always made space in her academic and her personal life for me, and I'm grateful for that. Though I think I was born and raised a positivist, I have developed and emerged as a socially informed, qualitative researcher. And I've really learned to value storytelling and narrative inquiry. The overarching objective of my research to date has really been to foreground the perspective, the experience, and the voice of the parasport athlete, and to those whose lives have been informed by parasport, sport administrators, healthcare providers, coaches, technical staff. So in keeping with the theme of today's presentation, I'm going to tell you of my own lived experience in a particular sporting space. Years ago, my husband and I arrived at a golf course in sunny Ireland. And yes, the course was located at the end of a typical Irish road, narrow, rutted, hard to find. We arrived just in time for the tee off. I say to my husband, "I'll meet you at the tee." And then I turn to the gentleman in the pro shop and I say, "Could you tell me where the ladies' room is?" And the lovely Irish man behind the pro shop counter says, "We don't have one." I said, "Pardon me?" He said, "We don't have one." And my rather perplexed look prompted him to qualify further and say, "Well, you know, not a lot of ladies play golf here." So keep that in mind as we explore the experience of disability and sporting spaces within the context of this presentation. I am the one in the expo hat. Because of my approach to the research, it is really important that you have some understanding of my subjectivity and my positionality. Aliza mentioned that I do have long-standing involvement with Paralympic sport here in Canada and abroad. I began my formal education as a physiotherapist and became involved with high performance sport dating back to my first Pan Am Games in 1995. I have been involved with 6 Paralympic Games and have been the chief therapist for 4 of those 6. So I have my own lived experience of parasport, Paralympic sporting spaces. It is that subjectivity that really does position me well to do credible and hopefully high quality ethnographic research within this sporting space and within this community of sport. So today, what I want to share with you, and I'm hoping it dovetails nicely with the intent and the mandate of the Adaptive Hub, is to talk about a small piece of my dissertation research, which, again, like most research, was really not the intent when I headed off to Commonwealth Games, but the exploration of how space enforces, mitigates disability, includes, excludes, and hopefully from this, you can take something forward into your own work. So in April of 2018, when international spectators and researchers were allowed to attend sporting events, I headed to Commonwealth Games in Gold Coast, Australia. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Commonwealth Games Federation adopted an integrated model for high performance sport back in 2002. And so I headed off to Gold Coast with the intention of speaking with as many parasport athletes and other members of the parasport delegation. At that time, I was particularly interested in the experience of medical encounters from the parasport athlete perspective. I had daily access to the athlete village, and I attended as many events as I could as a spectator, and really tried to immerse myself in the experience of this event. Analysis of my data, which consisted again of interviews and daily observation, demonstrated that from the parasport athlete experience of this particular event, keep in mind it's an integrated sporting event, was significant and was cause for further exploration of spatiality and disability in sporting spaces, with the hopes of generating some unique and new understandings from the perspective of the parasport athlete and those whose lives have been intimately informed by parasport. I mentioned earlier that I was born and nurtured a positivist and have come in part due to this rather transformational experience from a believer in the medical model of disability and the body to a much more social understanding of disability and the body. And I present to you one of my favorite quotes from still a remarkable scholar, that if we use the lens of disability when we look at sport, when we interrogate sport, we can use that lens like we can use a gendered lens or a racialized lens to make problematic, to be critical of how sport is put together, and to resist that the dominant assumptions around masculinity, heterosexuality, and able-bodiedness that are really still very pervasive in sporting spaces. I cannot hold myself out to be a disability scholar, but it is this lens that I bring to my daily work in my clinic and that I bring to my academic work. So, what do we know about sporting spaces? Or what do we know about the geography of space? We do know that how we think about space and how we build space includes some and conversely excludes others, and has a direct impact on the experience of that space, or in other words, the culture of that space. We know that some work has been done to look at sporting spaces from the perspective of the athlete. McGilvery, McPherson, and Meisner have done it, but they speak to a need to really look again at the experience of sporting spaces from the perspective of the parasport athlete, in contrast with the able-bodied athlete. Lefebvre, and I do love his writing, and it seems old, I'm sure, to just about everybody who's on this call, with the exception of myself and David and Carolyn. But for athletes to belong, to have the rights to their sporting space, they have every right to full citizenship, which is access and equity within those spaces. So we drew upon this kind of literature when we looked at the construction of spatiality and disability within the sporting space of the Commonwealth Games of 2018. I love this photo. It says a ton to me. It reminds us, and we hardly need reminding, that there is much political about sport and that some bodies are more political than others. We know that 5 million Canadians identify and live with impairment and are underrepresented in sporting spaces. And we know that experiences of bodies that are different, and this is a good friend of mine, and her body stands out when she rides her bike in the city of Barrie. As many people who live with impairment and disability, their bodies stand out in social spaces, including sporting spaces. Their experience of those spaces is not necessarily one of ease or of welcome. So the next two slides, and they're a little text heavy, but my work has really been intent on foregrounding the voice and the experience of the parasport athlete and their allies or their delegations. And if we look at some of the findings from Commonwealth Games 2018, sadly, some of it comes as no surprise. The village is still hilly. It was hilly in 1996, where athletes who used a chair often needed some assistance going from the transport mall back up to the dining hall. So some things have changed, and unfortunately many things stay the same. The second quote, I dropped into my national sport HST clinic, health sciences clinic, and interestingly, it's an integrated event, but I didn't see any of my parasport teammates there. And still, our clinic spaces are too tight. They're not welcoming for people who use a chair. Today's presentation title comes from a lengthy interview I had with a very passionate, well-informed, retired Paralympic athlete who spoke about too many chairs in the dining hall. That when you arrive in the dining hall now and you are an athlete who uses a wheelchair, you actually have to move the chairs in order to find a seat at the table. There are many more able-bodied athletes in those spaces, and the space is becoming ableized. I made a comment after my 10 or 11 days in the village that there was very little imagery informing this space regarding the 7 parasports that were featured in the competition schedule. There was very little of disability culture within the cultural programming related to the games, and little in the opening ceremonies. Transport was difficult in 1996, and transport was no less difficult in 2018. There was still a substantial step up or step down relative to your perspective with regards to train access that came right into the village. Wonderfully, this village in sunny Gold Coast, Australia, had neighborhood pools. And as athletes remarked, the pools were great. But if you were a seated athlete, you actually could not open the gate to the pool independently. You might be an athlete who has qualified for these games and use a chair, but you could not access these sites of social space and respite from the sun without help. I draw your attention to the bottom photograph rather than the quote beside it. Paratriathlon was one of the 7 sports included at Commonwealth Games 2018. And honestly, it was a sellout. I think the Aussies have a great affection for the sport. And interestingly, it happened outside rather than in interior sporting spaces. And we'll get to that in a bit. But if you'll note, because the fencing that was used for the paratri is the same fencing that was used for able-bodied triathlon, such that spectators of sport, and there were plenty, could not actually see the athletes out on the run or out on the ride. If I go back to my poorly told Irish story, right? Assumptions around who plays golf, therefore a need or no need to have a women's bathroom, was a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That women don't play golf here and therefore we have no bathroom, but one could easily argue that the assumptions around who plays golf is in part why they have no women's bathroom. We talk about space and we often limit our thinking to the built space, the physical environment. But the literature and our research findings tell us that it is our assumptions, it's our head space around space that has a very direct and perhaps integral role in how those spaces are created and how those spaces are experienced. The second quote speaks to the fact that bodies that are different, like my friend on the bicycle in hijab, stand out in certain spaces, and pools, though they are lovely, really made an impression on some of the athletes that we interviewed because they experienced a sense of hypervisibility about their disability in those spaces. This was an integrated games. I saw about one volunteer who had an obvious impairment. Perhaps there were volunteers that I couldn't identify as people who live with impairment, but this particular volunteer was obvious by the very fact that she was one. The top quote and the bottom quote are from volunteers and sport leaders. One being oblivious to the fact that there was a paratriathlon, and that must be just a form of entertainment rather than a sport on the competition schedule. And the second, the sport administrator, taking me on a tour of the village, talking about how unnecessary those shuttle buses, which are costly, really are. And if I took you back a slide or two, I think we had a quote from an athlete indicating that the village is hilly. The distances to the dining hall are long. And yet the assumptions or the headspace of the sport administrator seems to contradict that, right? These shuttle buses are unnecessary and they're a cost we incur that I really don't think we need to. I could have called this presentation simply pools, pianos, and the pub, because that is really, that statement really does sum up some of the really important findings when we looked at how athleticism and disability was experienced by parasport athletes and some members of their delegations. We learned that parasport athletes seem to gravitate to exterior spaces rather than interior spaces. We didn't see them in the fitness rooms. We didn't see them in the athletes' lounge, which has games and places to rest and use the internet. We saw them in exterior spaces. The image to the far right is an image from the village, and it is the village square. And located in this village square were all kinds of diverse ways of sitting. There were pianos, there were ice cream shops. There was place to socialize, there was place to be without the confining reality of pool gates you can't get into, ramps that are a bit too steep. And we really did find that as the parasport contingent lived through this games, we found them in public or exterior spaces more and more. We speculated in part because their bodily difference was less obvious than in interior spaces. So if I head off in a tangent and I think about what the mandate of the Adaptive Hub is all about and your summer programming, I ask you to keep that finding foremost in your mind. We talked a little earlier about pools. Pools really were a contested space. They were a space of hypervisibility, and we've all sat at a poolside and felt hypervisible, but it was a very consistent finding from our interviews with parasport athletes. And yet, they loved the pool space because once they got into the pool, interestingly, the water really did work to almost eliminate or make invisible the difference in bodily movement between themselves and their able-bodied counterparts. So I think there's lots to be learned and maybe more to explore the value of pool sport or water sport or socialization in the context of in pool, in water. The pub is almost self-explanatory, and it was one of my favorite places to finish up at the end of a night. It had indoor and outdoor seating. Access to this particular pub was, you could access it in many different ways, and we found that as the games wore on and athletes moved through their competition schedule, we saw a solid representation of both able-bodied athletes and parasport athletes in the pub. And again, social spaces, different ways of being, i.e. sitting high, sitting low, many points of access. And so they found this space and shared this space. So pools, pubs, pianos spoke volumes of how disability was not ignored, but made part of these shared spaces, in contrast with other locations in the village and in the sporting space of these games. This is the theoretical framework that I put together for my dissertation. And I think what it draws, hopefully what it draws your attention to is the primacy of foregrounding, listening to, valuing the embodied experience of high performance sport, or in the case of the Calgary Adaptive Hub, or in your own research work, athletes and sporting participants with diverse experience of sporting spaces. I would add to that headspace, the headspace that we bring, informed by multiple diverse experience of sporting spaces, is how we create equitable, accessible, inclusive sporting space. The research around space tells us that, yes, space can exclude, but space has real potential. And in particular, sporting spaces have real potential, even if it's temporary, to reflect the values that one decides you wish present in that sporting space. For example, having been in many Paralympic villages, and I know there are other people in this virtual space who have been in those same spaces, those who have impairment and live with disability will tell you, this is just great. This place is just has thought of everything. I really don't experience much disability in these particular spaces. I still have impairment, but I do not experience much disability because it has been constructed with a critical eye and creatively, with the hope of making real the values of access and equity in those spaces. So in your research or in the sporting spaces that you find yourself, you may think, this is just a temporary reality. Yes, and it's a start. And the research of Friedman, Engen will tell you that you take away something from those temporary spaces or sporting spaces where the values of equity and access have been highlighted and foregrounded, and you take it into other spaces. As a veteran of many games and many villages, these two photos were unique for me. If you're familiar with a village, countries go in, they set themselves up, they really claim their neighborhood, they hang their flags, they hang photos of team members, and usually they hang photos and banners of their most elite. Scotland, banner for banner, hung able-bodied athlete, parasport athlete, side by each, similar size. Everywhere you looked, Scotland had 1 for 1, 1 for 1, 1 for 1. So in the expression of that, we know they are valuing, they are making space or making their space a space of equity and inclusion for Team Scotland. For any of you who have seen a parade or marched in a parade of athletes that involves parasport athletes, typically athletes who are wheelchair users are at the front, followed by athletes who have an impairment who walk, followed by the rest of us. So you see the wheelchair using athletes out front, the walking athletes with impairment next rows, and then the able-bodied mission, medical, media staff. Australia came in, and of course they came in last, and they came in loud and proud, and they were the only delegation of that parade who marched in a completely integrated mass of athletes, able-bodied, para. You couldn't spot who was mission or media or medical. So they chose to disrupt the commonplace practice of foregrounding the athletes with the greatest impairment, and decided, no, we are one team, we are an integrated games, and that is how we're going to present ourselves. And it was really quite remarkable to me as a veteran of a number of games. Yes, I am an optimist. But more than once during my dissertation work, I turned to my advisor, Dr. Meisner, and I said, is power all about money? Is it always about money? And she'd smile and suggest that perhaps I should read a little more Foucault, and fail to answer my question. In an interview with a man who I've called Leon, he summed it up so nicely for me. At my club, there's a bus to transport athletes to training and competitions. We can transport 15 parasport athletes who walk, or we can transport 4 parasport athletes who use chairs. It's a real dilemma. We have this resource, and to use it efficiently, doesn't it make sense to take 15 versus 4? So think about Leon's bus. And there isn't an easy solution to Leon's bus. But there's some thoughts that I'll leave you with, that money does, you know it, come into the decision making in your own research projects, in the planning of a major games, in the implementation of the Calgary Adaptive Hub. And we have to use our limited resources efficiently and effectively. But I would argue that we also have to use them ethically. We need to make a systemic and a systematic commitment to sporting spaces that are equitable and accessible, that welcome my friend Hafisa on her bike, and welcome youth and adults from the greater Calgary area who live with disability to places of welcome and ease. And how do we do that? I think we do that most by examining our own headspace and our own assumptions about who belongs in those spaces, looking at who we see in those spaces, and more telling, who we don't see in those spaces. And as that quote suggests, we need to keep asking. We need to ask Canadians who live with a disability along the age continuum of their experience in the sporting spaces that we construct, or the sporting spaces in which we do our research. I, of course, think my own research is important for a variety of reasons. And if you don't think your own research is important, then perhaps you need to take a look at the research and why you're doing it. You have to be passionate about it. And I'm very fortunate. Being accepted to the 1996 Atlanta Paralympic Games was really transformational for me in terms of my understanding of sporting excellence, understanding that impairment is really my biology, but disability is the social reality of living with a body that is different or has impairment. So I think this research is important for a number of reasons. I indicated that I was born and nurtured a positivist, but I think qualitative inquiry was essential to get to achieving a better understanding of the how and why of spatiality and disability in sporting spaces. I suspect if we all sat around a table and had a casual conversation, you could probably identify what makes for sporting spaces that are welcome, accessible, and locations of ease. But you probably don't know why they are or how they came to be constructed this way. So I think qualitative inquiry has the opportunity, and I said this to Eliza in conversation, to help us tease out the how and the why, not just the what. In order for me to actually gain access to the voice and the experience of the parasport contingent at these games, I had to be present, I had to be very patient, and I had to persist. Like many groups of people whose voices are not highlighted, valued in the same way as more dominant voices are, originally they were a bit hesitant to sit down and have conversation with me. They haven't been listened to, they haven't been highlighted, they haven't been foregrounded enough. So I think methodologically, this work is important. We know, and perhaps some of you know better than I, about the low rates of participation in sport and physical activity for Canadians who live with impairment. And we know that ableist assumptions about space, social spaces, sporting spaces, impact how those spaces come together, and also impact who shows up in those spaces. I think most significantly, the athletes that I spoke to were absolutely delighted and filled with gratitude for being asked as primary stakeholders in this particular sporting space what their lived experience was of it, what you would do better, what you would change, and what the organizing committee, informed by their own headspace, did well. So I think with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to say thank you for listening to me. And I'm happy to entertain any questions that you might have